Muy buenos días, tengan todos ustedes. La Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, a través del Instituto de Arquitectura, Diseño y Arte y el Departamento de Arquitectura, les dan la más cordial bienvenida a este coloquio de investigación y arquitectura en contextos de emergencia. Para comenzar, me voy a permitir presentar a las autoridades que nos acompañan esta mañana. Se encuentra con nosotros el doctor Alejandro González Milea, coordinador del Coloquio de Investigación y Arquitectura en Contextos de Emergencia. Se encuentra también con nosotros el doctor Héctor Rivero Peña, coordinador de la Maestría en Arquitectura del Llevado y además coordinador del Coloquio de Investigación y Arquitectura en Contextos de Emergencia. Se encuentra también con nosotros el doctor René Ezequiel Saucedo Muñoz, jefe del Departamento de Arquitectura. Nos acompaña también el doctor Eric Sánchez Flores, coordinador de posgrados en representación de la doctora Beatriz Díaz Torres, coordinadora general de investigación y posgrado. Y en representación del maestro Juan Ignacio Camargo Nazar, rector de la UACJ, nos acompaña la maestra Guadalupe Gaitán Aguirre, directora del Instituto de Arquitectura, Diseño y Arte. Y bien, para comenzar le voy a ceder el micrófono al doctor René Ezequiel Saucedo Muñoz, jefe del Departamento de Arquitectura, para que nos dirija unas palabras. Adelante, doctor.
Buenos días a todos y buenos días, honorable presidio, doctor Alejandro González Milea, coordinador del Coloquio de Investigación en Arquitectura y Contextos Emergentes. Buen día, doctor Héctor Rivero Peña, coordinador de la Maestría en Arquitectura. Buen día, doctor Eric Sánchez Flores, coordinador de posgrados, en representación de la doctora Beatriz Araceli Díaz Torres. Buen día, maestra Guadalupe Gaitán Aguirre, y directora del Instituto de Arquitectura y Diseño. Sean todos bienvenidos a este primer encuentro Coloquio de Investigación en Arquitectura en Contextos de Emergencia, el cual se llevará a cabo los días 24 y 25 de marzo. Un poco de historia de este coloquio. Bueno, a partir del 2018, durante una revisión del núcleo del plan de estudios de la maestría en arquitectura, los profesores coincidían en dar, además de competencias a los posgraduados, que estuvieran en condiciones de atender y resolver problemas sociales. También era importante profundizar en el entendimiento de las calamidades, desastres y otras situaciones de riesgo. En ese sentido, es la creación de este coloquio, ¿no? En este coloquio nosotros estaremos viendo, en estos días el programa se va a componer de 2 conferencias magistrales y 6 mesas de trabajo, en un total de 31 ponentes provenientes de 12 universidades. Los conferencistas magistrales son destacados investigadores internacionales. El primero es el doctor Frédéric Graber, adscrito al Centro Nacional de Investigación Científica de París y el Centro Marc Bloch de Berlín. Hablará sobre los proyectos que han estado presentes desde hace mucho tiempo en la vida de las sociedades y sobre todo a través de interrogar en el ámbito de los expertos. Disertará sobre los momentos en que se ha debatido qué debe de hacerse, quién debe autorizar. El segundo conferencista magistral es Andrew Herscher de la Universidad de Michigan, el cual abordará un tema especialmente sensible en nuestros días: los millones de refugiados y desplazados que cruzan por territorios y ciudades. Su reflexión se ubica en la inserción entre el diseño y humanitarismo, para indagar las paradojas de las prácticas del diseño e insisten en servir en cuestiones en el orden político. Las 6 mesas de trabajo donde estarán los ponentes versarán en los temas de posturas críticas sobre emergencia y novedad, praxis de la arquitectónica en contextos de crisis y emergencia, posturas críticas sobre dinámicas urbanas, habitabilidad en contextos de crisis, alcances y posibilidades de la innovación y tecnología, patrimonio cultural y desastre. Todos estos participantes no solamente estarán presentes en situaciones muy concretas de riesgo y peligro y amenaza, sino también advierten cómo estos eventos impulsan la reflexión sobre nuestra comprensión del mundo y encierran implicaciones de relevancia para la técnica. Bueno, sean todos bienvenidos a la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, al Instituto de Arquitectura y Diseño y al Departamento de Arquitectura. Esperemos que lo que aquí se presente encuentre diálogos y sinergias y puedan contribuir a presentar estos temas de actualidad. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias al doctor Saucedo por sus palabras y a continuación escucharemos el mensaje y la declaratoria inaugural por parte de la maestra Guadalupe Gaitán Aguirre, directora del Llevado. Adelante, maestra.
Muchas gracias, David. Buenos días a todos. Agradezco a los organizadores la invitación que me extendieron para inaugurar este coloquio de investigación y arquitectura en contextos de emergencia, al doctor René Saucedo, jefe del Departamento de Arquitectura, al doctor Héctor Rivero Peña, coordinador de la maestría en arquitectura, al doctor Eric Sánchez Flores, coordinador de posgrados de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, y al doctor Alejandro González Milea, maestros y alumnos que hoy participan en la organización de este evento, pues que hoy nos tiene aquí reunidos. Muchas gracias por la invitación. En nombre del señor rector de la universidad, el maestro Juan Ignacio Camargo Naza, quien les envía a todos un fraternal saludo y que por cuestiones de agenda pues no puede asistir en este momento, pero a nombre de él y en mi nombre quiero darles la bienvenida a todos los participantes a nuestra institución y por supuesto a nuestro Instituto de Arquitectura, Diseño y Arte. Pues estamos en una época de muchos desafíos, situaciones muy retadoras que debemos enfrentar día a día y que no tienen que ver solo con la contingencia o con el tema ya tan mencionado del confinamiento, ¿verdad? Tenemos otras realidades muy palpables como, pues no sé, la transformación que han sufrido las familias, la inclusión de personas con capacidades diferentes, la constante migración que vivimos, que cada vez se acentúa más en nuestra ciudad. Aunque algunas personas dicen que ha disminuido, yo cada vez salgo poco, pero cuando salgo me topo con gente muy trabajadora que ya está muy instalada en nuestra ciudad y que es procedente de otros países, pero cada vez es más común encontrarme gente de Venezuela, de Honduras, gente de Cuba. Entonces, pues yo veo que la migración no ha bajado como se ha estado mencionando. También pues la desigualdad social, el cambio climático, ¿no? Los problemas raciales, cómo se han agudizado. Y esto por mencionar algunos de estos temas que se tratan no solo en los medios académicos o gubernamentales, sino que es la plática que tenemos cotidianamente con nuestras familias, en nuestras mesas, ¿no? Yo pienso que si la arquitectura nos permite percibir día a día la vida, la naturaleza, generar emociones, plantearnos actividades específicas en torno a ella, respirar diferentes entornos, pues entonces estos contextos emergentes deben de ser muy bien observados, estudiados, trabajados, investigados desde la academia, porque aquí es en donde se forma a quienes habrán de enfrentar esos desafíos a través de su profesión. Yo veo la arquitectura que conecta con la vida, con la percepción. Hay una cadenita ahí que viene, que es generar las emociones, las actitudes, los comportamientos, ¿no? A partir de lo que estamos viendo en la arquitectura. Y pues ahí podríamos seguir con una lista de todo lo que desencadena un proyecto arquitectónico. Ahora, si lo pienso en torno a estos contextos que he mencionado antes y otros que van surgiendo y que demandan que se cumpla con lo que la arquitectura en sí nos da, ¿no? La parte técnica, lo proyectual, lo estético, lo funcional, pues es importante que también para nuestros estudiantes aclaremos que lo emergente no solo es entendido como algo que surge de la tragedia o de las situaciones como la pandemia, los sismos, toda la desigualdad, sino que también puede verse desde un punto de vista de una necesidad natural, inmediata, por ejemplo, el crecimiento repentino de una empresa, la creación de espacios para el comercio con características urbanas, ahorita que necesitamos tanto estos espacios exteriores, espacios emergentes para la cultura, para el arte, ¿sí? Lo emergente que ahora también pues se le llama la optimización evolutiva, ¿no? Que es un concepto que se utiliza en la psicología, en los procesos industriales, en la tecnología, en diferentes disciplinas que es importante que converjan en algún momento, ¿no? Donde se busca el desarrollo positivo, potenciar las oportunidades que se nos presentan para desarrollar en este caso los proyectos arquitectónicos que van construyendo a las ciudades. Y una ciudad como la nuestra, con estas situaciones que mencioné antes, muy de migración, de adecuación, de multiculturalidad, pues es un punto neurálgico para dar paso al estudio de estos contextos, ¿no? Relacionados con la arquitectura. La arquitectura evoluciona, como evoluciona la sociedad, las necesidades urbanas, cómo se transforma la comunidad, cómo nos transformamos los miembros que componemos esta comunidad. jóvenes estudiantes que están atendiendo este evento, maestros. Tenemos mucho que trabajar, mucho que aprender, y pienso que convocatorias como esta que hoy estamos atendiendo son un regalo para ustedes antes de que salgan a vivir su vida profesional. Considérenlo de esa manera, ¿sí? Quiero felicitar a todos los ponentes que irán puntualizando los diferentes temas y que pues seguramente nos harán reflexionar qué estamos haciendo bien o mal desde nuestra postura como institución formadora. Y por supuesto quiero agradecer también a los ponentes de las conferencias magistrales, a los dos invitados, a Andrew Herscher de la Universidad de Michigan, a Frédéric Graber de la Escuela de Estudios Superiores en Ciencias Sociales y Centro Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas de París. Gracias a esta tecnología, pues podemos tenerlos cerca a pesar de las distancias y podemos aprovechar su conocimiento y su saber para compartirlo con todos los presentes. Y también nos beneficia el que este tipo de eventos se queden grabados, se queden aquí, para que más adelante quienes no pudieron atenderlo o algunas personas externas con quien queramos compartirlo, lo podamos compartir, ¿verdad? Y pues bueno, como el protocolo lo indica, vamos a inaugurar estos trabajos. Según mi reloj, son las 9:34 de la mañana. Sí, celebramos esta inauguración de los trabajos del Coloquio de Investigación y Arquitectura en contextos de emergencia. Muchas gracias a todos, bienvenidos, y les invito a atender con mucha receptividad todo lo que aquí se va a tratar, todo lo que se va a hablar. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a la maestra Aretán por su mensaje. Y bueno, de esta manera quedan inaugurados los trabajos del Coloquio de Investigación y Arquitectura en contextos de emergencia. Agradecemos también a las autoridades que nos acompañaron esta mañana en esta inauguración, a la maestra Guadalupe Gaitán, al doctor René Saucedo, al doctor Eric Sánchez. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana. Y bien, a continuación vamos a ceder el micrófono a quienes hicieron posible la organización de este coloquio. Vamos a cederle la palabra al doctor Héctor Rivero Peña, coordinador de la maestría en arquitectura y coordinador también del coloquio. Adelante, doctor.
Buenos días, muchas gracias y gracias a todos por estar, los que están ahora conectados, por estar aquí presente en este evento que nos entusiasma mucho iniciar y que seguramente va a ser de muchas reflexiones, de muchos pensamientos, de muchas ideas que seguramente van a surgir de aquí, ¿no? Y bueno, a mí me gustaría a lo mejor hacer una pequeña reflexión precisamente para empezar y a lo mejor es un poco crítica en torno a lo que hacemos los arquitectos, que generalmente nos gusta partir de situaciones normalizadas para empezar a trabajar. Generalmente hay una postura disciplinar muy pragmática en la arquitectura, una actividad muchas veces poco reflexiva, que buscan procesos lo más lineales posibles y buscan quitar o esconder la complejidad que siempre se nos presenta, ¿no? Esto es algo que se ve como algo muy común, que desvincula las situaciones externas a las que se enfrenta la arquitectura y la encierra muchas veces en valores muy disciplinares. Esta visión entiende la arquitectura eminentemente como un objeto a producir, a veces incluso se entiende como un objeto, y este objeto a producir que debe ser además extraordinario. Todo esto se suscribe en lo esperado, en lo normal. El contexto aquí solo es un accesorio. Parecería también que estos encuadres se repiten cuando estudiamos o investigamos la arquitectura, ¿no? Generalmente desde posturas sumamente especializadas, que parten de problemáticas puntuales ya muy conocidas, muchas veces también normalizadas, donde usualmente se sabe qué instrumentos o métodos se van a aplicar. Frente a esto, pues los resultados a veces ya son predecibles, sabemos a dónde se va a llegar, qué reflexiones se van a hacer, qué resultados se van a obtener. Sin embargo, la realidad es que esta llamada normalidad es completamente relativa, no sé si exista, y no estamos preparados para los arquitectos, para lo desconocido, para lo que no ha sido estudiado, para lo que no ha sido normalizado. Muchas veces estas situaciones en crisis, como ya comentaron, se presentan como desastres naturales, catástrofes, pandemia, y otras veces estas situaciones nos dan cuenta de lo dinámico y complejo que son los contextos en los que se inserta la arquitectura. Todo esto tiene manifestaciones en actos de construcción, destrucción y reconstrucción del territorio, lo cual es, me parece, poco entendido desde la práctica arquitectónica. Hay poco espacio para entender la arquitectura en contextos con fenómenos y problemáticas que no encuadran en lo disciplinariamente común, los cuales están presentes en la mayoría de las ciudades de México y Latinoamérica, desde la obsolescencia urbana, crisis energética, abandono de vivienda, por mencionar solo algunos de los grandes problemas que inclusive no son exclusivamente de la arquitectura, pero que tienen un gran componente en términos de lo arquitectónico, y que sin embargo son poco atendidos en su esencia, poco estudiados desde sus raíces, desde la arquitectura. De esta manera, este acercamiento a lo emergente, al parecer exigiría para estudiarlos, para investigarlos, ablandar estos marcos disciplinares que a veces son muy rígidos, y adoptar verdaderamente una visión multidisciplinar e interdisciplinar. Algo que generalmente se menciona mucho, pero que la verdad es que está poco presente operativamente en la investigación y en los programas de arquitectura en México. Así, me parece sumamente adecuado y pertinente que desde la frontera, desde una ciudad fronteriza como lo es Ciudad Juárez, un lugar muy complejo, muy dinámico, muy incierto, pues sea pertinente preguntarnos cómo nos acercamos desde la arquitectura a la emergencia y a lo emergente, y cómo lo estudiamos o investigamos. Estas, como también ya se comentó, fueron parte de las reflexiones que un grupo de profesores iniciamos hace 3 años, en el 2018, y que dio pie a la revisión y la generación del nuevo plan de estudios de la maestría en arquitectura, con un énfasis en contextos emergentes. Esto en un intento por empezar a comprender situaciones que surgen en lugares de gran complejidad, las cuales parecería que necesitan otras formas de acercarse a su estudio desde la arquitectura. El ingreso al Padrón Nacional de Posgrados de Calidad de la maestría me parece que da bien cuenta de la pertinencia de este tipo de programas en México. También de la misma manera, desde ese momento, desde hace 3 años, hablábamos de que esta reflexión, esta visión, no se podía quedar solamente encerrada dentro de las aulas, dentro de los seminarios internos, muy ricos, por cierto, muy interesantes, pero que valdría la pena hacer una extensión a otros colegas, a otras universidades, a otros espacios educativos y de investigación, para ampliar esta reflexión. Esto es precisamente lo que nos lleva al coloquio en este momento, a precisamente abrir este espacio de reflexión, este espacio de investigación, este espacio de diálogo para estudiar la arquitectura y los contextos de emergencia. Por eso estamos hoy aquí. Bueno, quisiera agradecer a los ponentes por su entusiasmo, por su interés en este coloquio, a los conferencistas magistrales también por su confianza que han tenido con nosotros y sus atenciones, también a todo el staff que hay detrás, al departamento, al instituto, al departamento de arquitectura, al Instituto de Arquitectura, Diseño y Arte, a la gente de diseño, a la gente de las plataformas, que nos estuvo apoyando desde hace algún tiempo, y especialmente quiero agradecer al doctor Alejandro González Milea, que no solo ha puesto su esfuerzo para la organización y la realización de este coloquio, que lo ha hecho de manera muy puntual, con mucho cariño, con mucha finura, sino que a mí me parece que también, bueno, no me parece, también ha sido la guía teórica que ha lanzado las preguntas, las ideas, las reflexiones, conocimientos que nos han permitido ir dándole claridad a este evento y a la maestría misma. También aprovecho el espacio para mandar un cordial saludo y una pronta recuperación a la doctora Joana Lozoya, quien iba a estar como conferencista magistral y que desgraciadamente por una situación de COVID tuvo que cancelar casi al último momento. Deseamos pronta recuperación. Y también que este evento, me parece, pueda servir como un pequeñito homenaje al doctor Antonio Toca, este gran maestro, arquitecto, investigador, cronista de la arquitectura en México, quien aceptó participar de forma muy entusiasta y activa en el comité científico de este coloquio y que desgraciadamente falleció en enero de este año, ¿no? Pues en paz descanse el doctor Antonio Toca. Pues gracias nuevamente por estar aquí. Seguramente van a encontrar cosas muy interesantes, a lo mejor no las más comunes en términos de la investigación en la arquitectura, pero que sí buscamos que se salgan un poquito, por lo menos, de estos marcos comunes de entender situaciones que nos están afectando en nuestro día a día, en nuestra cotidianeidad, en la forma en que habitamos este mundo y las ciudades, ¿no? Gracias, muy amables.
Muchas gracias al doctor Héctor Rivera por sus palabras y a continuación escuchamos al doctor Alejandro González Milea. Adelante, doctor.
Gracias. Buenos días a todas, a todos. Agradezco los cumplidos, también agradezco mucho que tengamos aquí a las autoridades, a todo el público. Como estamos un poco ya justos de tiempo, creo que, bueno, refrendo todo lo que comenta Héctor, lo que también nos comparte la perspectiva de la maestra Guadalupe Gaitán y del doctor René Ezequiel Saucedo. Me gustaría agregar muy brevemente algunas cositas porque tendremos ya mucho tiempo para platicar en las sesiones sobre el tema que nos ocupa, pero creo que fue muy interesante para comentar lo siguiente. Encontrar a los conferencistas magistrales adaptados para esta temática fue un ejercicio interesante porque nos encontramos de pronto con dos tipos de perfiles. Gente que ha estado trabajando problemáticas poco usuales de manera sostenida. Pero también encontramos conferencistas magistrales que de pronto incursionaban en los campos que nos interesaban, pero después se iban a otras cosas, ¿no? Entonces fue difícil como encontrar a las personas adecuadas que pudieran, digamos, ocuparse de rarezas, pero al mismo tiempo estar concentrados en ellas durante largo tiempo. También quiero comentar, agradezco de manera muy especial a todos los colegas que tengo del día a día en la universidad. Creo que gracias a un montón de conversaciones que tenemos en los pasillos, bueno, ahora en las pantallas, y en los pequeños seminarios y comités, esto, bueno, dice Héctor que yo lo construí, pero la verdad es que lo hemos estado construyendo juntos. Venimos 3 años discutiendo estos temas y, bueno, creo que lo que pude hacer es darle forma más o menos y sí que les agradezco mucho a ustedes y a todos los alumnos de posgrado también, ¿no? Esto es muy importante. Más adelante estaremos dando una serie de avisos como de índole más operativa respecto a aconsejarles entrar a las sesiones siempre 15 minutos antes para revisar la configuración de sus dispositivos, el uso de los chats en conferencias magistrales y cuestiones de este tipo. Pero por lo pronto, pues, no me queda más que agradecer a la universidad que nos permite hacer este bellísimo trabajo que nos gusta mucho y que nos dé este espacio, ¿no? Es un privilegio. Yo concluiría con esto y nos veremos los siguientes días. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Alejandro Milea, por sus palabras. Y agradecemos también a todos los asistentes que nos acompañaron esta mañana en la inauguración de nuestro coloquio. A la vez queremos comentarles que vamos a tener un pequeño receso, solicitándoles regresar aquí a la sala a las 10 de la mañana para dar inicio con nuestra conferencia magistral. Gracias a todos y nos vemos en unos minutos.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, muy buen día a todos.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Gracias.
Bien, buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta primera conferencia del Coloquio Investigación y Arquitectura en Contextos de Emergencia. Me permitiré hablar una pequeña parte antes de presentar a Frédéric. Me parece importante explicar cómo lo descubrimos, por qué nos pareció importante su trabajo. And then I will continue in English, presenting a short bio of Frédéric Graber and stating some issues we need to know in relation to our screen where we can put questions and comments. Bien, quería empezar un poco comentándoles rápidamente por qué nos pareció muy importante el trabajo de Frédéric. Creo que todos recordarán muy bien al doctor Carlos González Lobo, quien comentaba, le gustaba mucho platicar en sus experiencias de trabajo, que los arquitectos muchas veces llegan a lugares en donde las gentes y las personas están haciendo ya muchas cosas, ¿no? La gente está embarcada en proyectos constantemente tratando de conseguir ciertos logros, ciertas cosas, a veces expresados en entornos construidos, a veces no, porque están en una fase inicial. Y él decía muchas veces que los técnicos o los arquitectos o los ingenieros podían llegar en estos procesos y tal vez lograr colocar una cereza en el pastel, en un pastel que la gente ha venido construyendo por sí misma, o bien hacer un destrozo de este pastel que la gente hace con mucho esfuerzo. Creo que cuando yo me encontré con el trabajo de Frédéric, lo primero que me asombró muchísimo es cómo él colocaba el problema de los técnicos de muchos tipos de disciplinas y profesiones dentro del gran mundo de los proyectos que existen desde hace mucho tiempo en la vida social. Es lo que nos llamó muchísimo la atención. Entonces, voy a continuar presentando al doctor Frédéric Graber, una breve biografía. También quiero llamarles la atención sobre que en la pantalla, en la parte superior del lado derecho, tenemos una sección de preguntas y respuestas. Voy a pedir de manera muy atenta que quienes puedan y quieran transmitir sus comentarios o preguntas en idioma inglés, se los agradeceré, me ayudarán mucho, porque solo habrá oportunidad de que yo lea los comentarios para que Frédéric retroalimente. Quienes no lo puedan o no lo quieran hacer y prefieran el idioma español, prometo hacer mi mejor esfuerzo para traducirlo al inglés de la manera más correcta que me sea posible. Well, I will continue with reading a short bio of Frédéric Graber. Frédéric is a historian of science, technology, and the environment. He's a research fellow at the French Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, usually based at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He's on leave for the next 2 years at the Center Marc Bloch in Berlin. Frédéric has been working on the history of engineering, water supply projects, property issues, and more generally on administrative tools for industrial and infrastructural development from the 18th century and the history of projects from the 16th century. He has published numerous articles and 4 books. Paris au besoin de eau on 2009, on water supply projects for Paris in the early 19th century. An Introduction to Environmental History, 2014, with 3 French colleagues, and Posséder la Nature in 2018, a reader edited with Fabien Lochet on environment and property, and the book Le Projet, une histoire politique en 2018, edited with Martin Girardot on the long-term history of projects. His latest book on administrative posters in 19th century France will come out next year in France. So I welcome Frédéric. We are very attentive to your conference and thanks to be here with us.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. So first I would like to thank the organizers and especially Alejandro for inviting me. I'm not an architect, not even a historian of architecture, but I think we do have a lot of themes in common, and I hope this will be an opportunity to discuss them. In this presentation, I would like to introduce a research agenda that I've been working on for the last 2 decades, a history of projects. It strikes me that projects have become unavoidable objects of contemporary life. Everyone is living and working with projects today, far beyond the classical projects professions, engineers or architects. People in the past have at times been obsessed with projects too, the most obvious period being the early modern, which has been described by contemporaries, Defoe for instance, as an age of projects. One of my questions is about how our project-oriented present differs from other periods in history. But there is another striking fact about our living in a world of projects. Projects, strangely, have not become a major theme in the social sciences. So there are a few obvious reasons for that. The main being that we don't know exactly what projects are on that general scale. As a word, it is extremely polysemic. It ranges from a vague intention to act to specific rules for organizing human actions. It is thus very slippery to talk about projects generally. Each discipline has its own definition, usually quite incompatible with other ones. So adopting a definition or another frames many things as being projects or not. There are not many works in the social sciences which concentrate explicitly on projects, but there have been a few, especially since the 1990s, and I will take a few examples concentrating on the most famous ones, because beyond the diversity of approaches, they reveal a common trend. My first example is a book by Bruno Latour, called Aramis, or The Love of Technology. The book is focused on a major public transportation project for Paris in the 1970s and 80s. A personal rapid transit. It's a kind of hybrid between taxi and train. The book takes this particular case in order to develop a theory of projects. Latour has a radical definition of projects, which has been quite influential. According to Latour, projects are fictions. They are things that are not existing. They may be on the way to existence, but when they finally exist, there is no project anymore. Projects, therefore, are synonymous with technological innovations. They are about things that don't exist today, but will perhaps exist tomorrow. Projects, according to Latour, are not a particular form of action. They are not defined by objectives, not even by a specific relation to time and space. In this view, a project is fundamentally a process, an open process in which various actors negotiate, but they can never say in advance what will eventually become of it. Let me take a second example in the history of technology. A few years ago, Philip Scranton, a historian at Rutgers University, called for a history of projects, which he defined as non-routine activities. In his view, any form of action that repeats itself or displays normal functioning cannot be a project, because a project always involves uncertainty, chaos, and urgency. This definition is very much related to Scranton's research focus on the development of jet propulsion during the Cold War. This was a very specific context when the United States government wanted a technology as soon as possible at any cost, and therefore decided to finance anyone pretending to be able to produce such engines. This did indeed lead to a specific dynamic, with numerous actors trying out all sorts of things, failing most of the time, trying something else, until finally some of these projects succeeded producing jet propulsion technologies. But even in the history of technology, there are not so many examples of that kind of desperate and costly innovation strategy, so that it seems somehow strange to choose such a radical definition of project, a definition that doesn't fit the classical project professions so well, especially architecture, as Scranton recognized himself. This definition owes a lot to Scranton's main theoretical reference in respect to projects, Zygmunt Baumann's book Liquid Modernity. Baumann's thesis postulates a major shift in the 1970s, when after a century of what he called solid modernity, where everything had to fit in standardized administrative routines, the development of financial capitalism led us into a world of volatility and flexibility, in which all routines and long-term engagements became economically and politically dangerous. For Baumann, as later for Scranton, projects are par excellence the mode of action in a precarious world, because they are about managing the uncertain in the short term. There is a similar line of thought developed by several sociologists in France and Germany in the 1990s and early 2000s. Boltanski and Chapello, for instance, argued in a book called The New Spirit of Capitalism that projects became the dominant norm of capitalism after the 1980s. In this book, projects are defined by the limited time frame in which various people come to work together on a one-shot basis and then separate. Projects, in this sense, are not only precarious, they are evaluating the ability of people to be part of temporary arrangements, again and again. Projects, in this understanding, follow major transformations of work in the last decades from routines to non-routine activities. Most of the theories of projects postulate a turning point in the late 20th century, around the 1980s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it, at least to some extent, the very idea of state planning, of centralized long-term planning. There is an intellectual history of these theories of projects, which is strongly embedded in the idea that forms of action changed radically, both theoretically and practically, after 1980s. After this turning point, the idea that one cannot really decide in advance what could or what should be done in the future becomes more and more influential. According to this line of thought, we are, so to speak, prisoners in a drifting present, able only to adapt to a chaotic future that is coming to us, but any attempt to decide about the future is deemed at best utopia or at worst authoritarian. A history of projects, therefore, has to include a discussion about the various ways societies conceive action and future as related in some ways. Though there are different definitions of projects in the work of the few authors I picked up, they are all stressing similar dimension: singularity, precariousness, processuality. Projects after the 1980s are supposed to be singular processes, dealing with the uncertainties of a rapid changing world, almost chaotical, bringing together flexible strangers in a limited time frame. Now, I'm uncomfortable with these theories for several reasons. For historians, radical singularity is a methodological problem. If each project is an island of novelty, emphasizing technological and institutional innovation, if each project is a process of birth of something that never existed before, then it cannot be compared to any other project. Each project stands alone, and one cannot write a history of projects because projects don't have much in common. Paradoxically, if you take these theories seriously, then projects are not really a feature of our social lives. At best, they become a label for the disintegrations of routines and professions. If one wants to write a history of projects, one will have to pay more attention to certain dimensions of projects which are usually overlooked: routines, regularities, repetitions, rules, and norms. These dimensions are overlooked because they are not valued in the rhetoric of projects and in the various theories of projects which are available to us. Most projects claim they are creative, innovative, groundbreaking, or even revolutionary. I could argue that most of what humans call innovation is actually rhetoric, developed in order to sell, usually to sell again an old thing as something completely new, or to convince decision makers that it is worth trying, that it is profitable, useful, or beautiful, because it hasn't been tried before. As historians of technology point out, innovation is a matter of perspective. If you take cars, for instance, in its main parts, a car today is very close to what the Ford T model was 100 years ago. Cars did indeed evolve towards reduced fuel consumption and noise, improved security and comfort issues. Most of these innovations are quite cosmetic on the long run, but it is very important for car producers to stress these minor improvements in order to make old cars appear old-fashioned and new ones desirable. Innovation, after all, is a crucial part of planned obsolescence. I know that, as historians usually do, I tend to consider that there are few new things under the sun. So let me formulate that argument in more moderate terms. To some extent, projects may introduce some forms of novelty, be it technical or social. But we shouldn't take for granted that it is always the case, that novelty is the most important feature of projects, and that novelty is essentially contradictory with routines, repetitions, and normality. After these introductory elements, I would like to present the alternative socio-historical perspective on projects that I've been developing. The simplest way to introduce that new perspective is probably to explain how I came to think about projects. 20 years ago, I was writing my dissertation on French public work engineers in the early 19th century, a state institution called Ponts et Chaussées, which was in charge of building roads and bridges, harbors and canals, and many other infrastructure for the French state. It is an old institution created at the beginning of the 18th century, which still exists today. I focused on a period of crisis of this institution following the French Revolution under Napoleon, when these engineers were quarreling all the time. This was interesting because usually these engineers were very restrained in their disputes. In this period of crisis in the 1800s, engineers explicitly discussed what they thought a project should be, while in other periods the basic features of projects were more implicit and therefore much more difficult to assess for historians. The discussion had many dimensions. I will only present a few. Project making in the Ponts et Chaussées first of all appeared to be about the uses of relevant knowledge and know-how, about using specific tools, intellectual tools, but also instruments, like, for instance, the level, which you probably know is an instrument for measuring relative altitudes. These engineers were the best levelers of their time, and they were using their precision in order to reject projects proposed by outsiders, civil engineers, or project makers of all sorts. Because the state gave all projects to the Ponts et Chaussées for evaluation, these engineers could use the argument of insufficient precision in leveling in order to reject and sometimes appropriate the ideas of others. It's a classical issue, actually, in the history of science, that precision has a strong social dimension and that it is constantly used to draw exclusion lines. Inside the Ponts et Chaussées, the project had to be presented in specific forms, graphical and textual, in a specific order and using specific tools, especially rhetorical ones. There were certain kinds of arguments you could use as an engineer in order to defend a certain kind of projects. Obviously, in the context of the Ponts et Chaussées, one could not promote a project with any kind of argument, but only with arguments accepted in that milieu as rhetorical commonplaces, as acceptable and convincing. The formative years of these engineers were about acquiring these technical and rhetorical know-how that would make a project acceptable and convincing. Not respecting these norms would lead to rejection of a project or to an open conflict among engineers. The Ponts et Chaussées also had social rules about projects. There was usually one engineer chosen to be in charge of a project, usually a senior one. He had what was called the prerogative of initiative. He could choose his ways and means and develop the project as he wished. But afterwards, his colleagues gathered in an assembly would evaluate the project. The engineer in charge had a personalized understanding of the project. Though he had other colleagues working for him, he usually understood the project as being his work that would be attached to his name. His name would even be mentioned somewhere on the building. But at the same time, the Ponts et Chaussées understood itself as an institution working for the state, with a collective responsibility. So when a project complied with general expectations, it was usually adopted. But the Assembly of Engineers always suggested small improvements in order to make the project more collective. These changes couldn't be major ones. The engineer in charge would have protested that the project was dénaturé or even stolen from him. But these changes had to be significant enough in order to put a collective touch on the project, because the Assembly considered projects to be a collective issue. When you look at institutions like the Ponts et Chaussées, you get a clear sense that project making is not a completely open process where things just happen, when people just negotiate, but that projects are also about following norms, rules, routines. And it is so because projects are not an individual issue, but a collective one. Because different people in the process of project making consider they have a role to play, that they are part of it, or that they will have a part in a decision to come. So after working on these public works engineers, I asked myself how this kind of institution came into being, because obviously the importance of rules and routines was linked to the fact that it existed as an institution. So I turned to the early modern period in order to look at how project making was regulated before this kind of institutions appeared. To my great surprise, I discovered that projects had been a very polemic issue in the early modern period. The word project appeared in most European languages around the 16th century with the meaning of scheme or plan. But the important point is that it quickly became a very ambiguous concept, associated foremost with the activity of so-called projectors, faiseurs de projet, projectista, Projektemacher. There is a word for that in many languages. Projectors were people coming up with ideas for improvements and profits and appealed to states, investors, and emerging private companies for authorization, encouragement, or finance. The projector promised to produce fortunes with novelties, but in most cases they failed to do so, and in some cases they even took the money and got lost. The projector was thus always suspected to be a deceiver or a crook. Nevertheless, investors, states, and companies wanted them to be true. Projects didn't become ambiguous just because projectors generally failed. There are also cultural reasons for that. Projects were about profits and novelties, which were two problematic things in the early modern. Making profits was deemed morally problematic and only gradually became tolerable, and novelties were potentially destabilizing for societies based on legal inequality and thus very concerned with the preservation of order. The early modern is precisely the time in history where desires for profit and novelties build up as more and more acceptable, and this is what projects are about. Projectors were therefore understood as a problem by the very people who wanted their dreams of fortune to become true. Projectors were too uncertain to trust. There could be a kind of pleasure in that uncertainty, and many contemporaries understood the investment in a risky project as a game, in which you know you had little chances of winning, but if you win, you could get fantastically rich, like in playing a lottery. Lottery, by the way, being one of the typical novelties the early modern projectors came up with. To a certain extent, the risky and unrealistic dimensions of projects were part of their success. But more and more investors, states, and companies tried to gain a form of control on these uncertainties. Throughout Europe, new professions and institutions appeared during the early modern with the explicit task of evaluating projects on their feasibility and profitability. In France, for instance, the Academy of Science, founded in 1666 by Louis XIV, was explicitly charged of assessing the myriads of technical projects submitted to the government in order to identify which ones could be useful to the state. A significant part of these projects up to the mid-18th century were perpetuum mobile, which are a typical form of early modern project because they combine the invention of a new technology with the prospects of infinite wealth. Since if you had a machine working without energy supply, you would automatically become very rich. The so-called cameral sciences in the German states were similar phenomena. Early modern German states increasingly recruited men of science, acting both in universities and government, pretending to develop a rational approach to improvements of all kinds. Many technical administrations appeared in that context, like the various engineering corps in France, specialized in public works, mining, fortification, etc. These institutions contributed significantly to the professionalization of engineering, especially with the creation of specialized schools. But this story is not exactly about the replacement of incompetent and fraudulent projectors by rational experts. The problem of the unreliability of projectors never completely disappeared, and in fact, the emerging experts contributed themselves to this problem. If one analyzes the trajectories of members of the French Academy of Science or German cameralists, it appears that many of them were themselves projectors, eager to promote their novelties and often confronted to failure. The creation of these various boards of expertise didn't prevent strong conflicts of interests. If the experts considered themselves as specialists able to distinguish good projects, they were themselves very often criticized as projectors. This detour through the early modern introduces a different dimension of project, which is about control. On the one hand, there is the control of investments. Investors, private companies, and states alike did want to control the project in order to make sure that it worked and that funds were not misappropriated. Projects, therefore, were submitted to examinations, which meant that they had to comply with all kinds of rules, especially accounting rules, which gradually became more important during the early modern. On the other hand, on a more general level, projects were more and more understood as being able to transform the world, environment, and society. Each project, in this sense, had a political dimension. It raised the question of what kind of change are acceptable and who should decide about them. The creation of institutions specialized in the evaluation of projects is only one part of a growing number of regulations and procedures imposed on projects. The purpose of these regulations is not necessarily to discourage projects generally. In some cases, like the ponts et chaussées of the 18th and early 19th century, the creation of a state administration could lead to a monopoly on a given form of projects. Conceiving and building roads and bridges in France during that time is impossible outside the frame of this specialized administration. But it is not about discouraging projects and novelties per se. It is about who is legitimate to conceive, decide, and implement a given type of projects. Let me take another example with industrial projects. Building an industrial plant was quite risky in the 18th century. Since neighbors could go to court, and if they were able to prove that the plant was significantly disturbing their environment, they could obtain the destruction of the plant. In order to secure capital investments and encourage industrial development, new administrative regulations were introduced in early 19th century France. Entrepreneurs had to apply for an administrative authorization. In the procedure, administrators checked a few basic requirements, standard distance from neighboring buildings, height of chimney, and so on. All projects that would fit these requirements would be authorized, and no court could later on order their destruction. Authorization can be about securing projects as much as about forbidding them. And in most cases, it is doing both at the same time. It is defining how projects should look like, by whom they should be conceived, and what kind of knowledge and tools should be used. After these lengthy historical detours, I may introduce my definition of projects. Projects are actions that have to be authorized, that are struggling for authorizations. You may understand these authorizations as localized in decision-making moments. For instance, if you would like to build a house, you would have to get the money from the bank, the plan from an architect, a building permit from the local authority, and so on. But these decision-making moments have larger implications because people are working towards these moments all the time, and their work will take into account not only explicit norms like legal obligations, but also more or less implicit ones, professional habits and shared values that they know to be important to make the project convincing and acceptable. Authorizing is about getting accepted, and therefore it is also about complying with the expectations of others. It is a very large definition, which allows me to include all the major forms of action that have been thought of as projects in history. This definition is not exclusive of other ones. It doesn't decide in advance that something is not a project because it is not innovative or time-framed or something else. This definition insists on several things that are underestimated in most approaches. It insists on the professionalization of project making. In a given context, actors are not making projects as if it was the only one. They are doing projects again and again, and they are confronted to the same actors and problems again and again. Project making is a repeated activity. This definition also insists on the political dimension of projects. Projects are not individual, they are collective actions. That is not to say that there isn't one person who understands himself as the project leader or as the designer, as the author or something of that kind. Projects are collective because various actors think they have a role to play, that they have legitimacy to do or to decide about certain things at certain moments. By focusing on authorization, I see projects like small constitutions, reflecting the powers and positions of the various actors. These constitutions, of course, depends on the context. They are obviously not the same for architectural projects, for developmental projects, or financial projects. They may depend strongly on national frames, on educational systems, on legal settings, on professional cultures, etc. And of course, these constitutions evolve over time. For instance, in the case of the Ponts et Chaussées, up to the 1820s, projects were decided in a very narrow arena of state engineers and administrators. But in the 1820s, a large canal scheme of the Ponts et Chaussées became a financial disaster for the state, and after that scandal, legislation was changed. From then on, all projects had to be presented to the public in form of a simplified version that anyone could have access to in order to formulate comments and objections. The introduction of a new actor, the public, went with the new procedures, new norms for project documents, which framed the possible role this new actor, the public, could have in the procedure. That role was in fact quite limited, but not inexistent. The very fact that engineers had to publish their projects led to major transformation in their work. Insisting on rules and routine is not defending them. I am not saying that they are the best ones or the most legitimate. Rules and routines are what they are. They are institutionalized, recognized, and to some extent challenged in a given social context. But I do think that there is no project making without such rules. The current tendency to insist on innovation, on singularity, on open processes without constraints, on free arrangements is problematic. Such theories are suggesting that there are no political questions behind project making, that there is no inequality of powers between project participants. Project making, as for instance Bruno Latour understands it, is operating in a flat world without power issues. In such a world, if someone doesn't succeed, it's mainly because he wasn't able to negotiate properly, as if everybody had the same competence, as if everybody equally understood the implicit expectations of others, as if everybody had an equal access to finance, to relevant knowledge, etc. Who should decide about what should be done? These kinds of political questions are important in order to understand how projects work, but they are quite absent in the social sciences. It is especially the case in the history of technology. The history of engineering, for instance, has traditionally emphasized the individual figure of the engineer as the sole creator of new technologies. Though obviously the engineer was not doing all the work by himself. Historians used to present his contribution as the only relevant part of that work. Though obviously he was operating in a specific professional and legal context, he was presented as if he was inventing himself and the world every day anew. In the last decades, however, a few scholars have tried to give more realistic accounts of engineering, distancing themselves from such a history of great men. These new histories of engineering are crowded with actors never seen before, but they tend to be very influenced by contemporary theories of projects as singular and open-ended. Let me take an example. In a fascinating book, French historian Nathalie Montel described the construction site of the Suez Canal in the second half of the 19th century. The emphasis on construction was really welcomed, since that was typically the part that remained invisible in most books, concentrating on the conception side, on the design of the engineering, on drawings and blueprints. Montel brilliantly showed that the construction side was not a simple material transposition of ideas, but that numerous things happened there that had not been anticipated and that called for decisions and inventions. Entrepreneurs and workers in the field had to invent solutions for overcoming these difficulties and actually build the canal. An in-depth analysis of the construction side led Montel to a fundamental critique of the division between conceiving and implementing, between designing and implementing. Engineers had imagined a canal. They had prepared maps and calculated earth movings and cost estimates, but all these documents and graphs, Montel argued, could not build the canal, and in the end they appeared quite powerless. Montel understood the project as an open process. The documents, which the engineer described as being the projects, were to her no more than a starting point, from where many actors would have to negotiate with the real world in order to make a canal become possible. In that understanding, the division between conception and implementation is a fiction. But if it is, the very activity of engineers making plans and estimates becomes difficult to understand. Why would they spend so much time and money preparing these documents if in the end projects were decided in the field? The division between conception and implementation is a classical labor division. It has been quite important historically for the emergence of engineering as a profession. There is no need for engineers, after all, if artisans and entrepreneurs can do the job in the field by themselves. The very concept of engineer and of the architect later on presume that there is a need for that kind of intermediary. In the case of Montel's Suez Canal, engineers didn't develop plans and estimates just as a sketch to be rewritten in the field by others. They produced these documents for shareholders and decision makers in Paris and London, which had to be convinced that the canal was feasible and profitable. Engineers and executives alike didn't want the main decision to be made in the field by subcontractors, so the documents they produced were also trying to discipline these entrepreneurs in order to control them and to limit their autonomy as much as possible. The case of the Suez Canal is indeed one in which such a control appeared very difficult for many reasons, but even in that case, executives tried to maintain as much control as they could and made it very clear that they didn't want the main decision to be made in the construction site, far away in Egypt. Let me come to a conclusion. As a historian, I'm interested in projects as a long-term phenomenon. We have been living with projects for centuries, and most of them appear to be institutionalized objects. My approach, therefore, emphasizes regular dimension of projects, the definition of requirements, norms, and standards, of rules for conceiving, writing, drawing, discussing, deciding, and implementing. Each project has indeed a life of its own. It faces specific issues, difficulties, drawbacks, and one can never tell in advance how it will end. But it is nevertheless deeply embedded in institutional regularities. Some actors may perceive these routines as bureaucratic, inhibiting their talent, their brilliant new solutions to major problems, or their ability to make money. Some think it would be fantastic to get rid of these constraints they think of as illegitimate. We should be aware that such statements are political. Someone is arguing he should have more autonomy, more power to decide about the world as it should be, because such routines are at the heart of what projects are about, authorizing. Projects are never only the idea of an individual, but a collective undertaking involving institutions which want to be part of it or have it authorized, have to authorize it first, be it from a professional, political, financial, or administrative point of view. Projects are asking the question of who should decide about what should be done and, of course, how much it should cost. In this sense, projects are a key object of the political and economic history of the modern world. It may seem strange to you that I wanted to emphasize these regular dimensions of project making in a conference that focuses on urgency and abnormality. When one thinks of urgency and abnormal situation, one usually ends up thinking about singular solutions to singular problems, about innovations as a response to new challenges. I would like to stress two things in that respect. My first comment is about the nature of urgency. Historically speaking, catastrophes and disaster have been major occasions to impose new agendas, change the rules, and for some actors, take more power. The European states in early modern period, for instance, imposed strong regulations on rivers and forests as response to environmental crisis of the early modern period. If the crises were really as dramatic is debated, but the result is a radical change of rules concerning what should be done with forests and rivers. Urgency can be very real, but it always creates an occasion for imposing a new socio-political order. So urgency should not necessarily lead us to think of projects as singular. On the contrary, moments of urgency are raising the political dimension of project making anew. My second comment is that innovation is not at all a characteristic of abnormal and urgent situations. Novelties are what project makers have been selling all the time. Historically speaking, innovations have been responsible for most of the world's problems. Each generation comes up with new innovations in order to respond to the problems created by previous innovations. So we shouldn't take for granted that we should look for novelties, that novelties will be the ultimate solutions. As historians of technology urges us to do, we should shift our attention from innovations to uses and give old-fashioned technologies the same cultural relevance as new ones. But of course, changing the importance of innovation is also about changing the role and importance of project-making professions. The classical expert professions like engineers and architects emerged during the early modern as mediators. As historians of science and technology have described it, these experts separated from the world of artisans and stressed that they were able to do better. Artisans were experienced. They could do things they had done before. But the new experts could produce new things never done before. In order to convince investors that they were able to do such things, they gave priority to more abstract language and tools, which made them socially closer and more acceptable to the elite society. They had to become socially closer to the rich and powerful in order to sell them their projects, but also in order to represent their master's will in the direction of operations, standing above the artisans in distant locations. Reassessing the importance of novelties in expert professions, therefore, leads to reimagining the relations of the various actors involved in a project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frédéric. I presume you will maintain, you will be in the front of the screen. It seems to me. I think this is the way it works. This software. Thanks a lot for your speak. I will proceed to make comments that are appearing in the chat from Elisa. Elisa says, in the discussion, the Professor Graber suggests that the future cannot be controlled, and if tried, this control led to utopianism or authoritarianism. In this context, what role does the project play as a process that arises in an emergency that requires an immediate action, or on the contrary, a more permanent way of addressing the problem? This is one question. Maybe we can wait a little for another one. Let's see if we have one more. Well, if we don't have another one comment for now, I would like to make a comment or also a question now. I work as an historian on history and architectural historian, and it seems to me very interesting. I would like your comment about that. In the last decades, there is like a change of view in what should be historicized or researched in historical sense. So the scope of the historians is abandoning the big works, all these monumental and like the Canal de Suez example, and are turning their interest to the works of everyday life. So it means we are not interested in the big palaces, big bridges, but we are trying to research about how the peasant houses were built and what documentation have about these processes in the fields. Because for historians like Howard Davis from Minnesota, it seems to me, what is urgent for us today to understand the world is not the masterpieces of humanity, but the other side. So what was common and constant in everyday life. And we have a third comment, Frédéric. I'm not sure if you can read the chat.
Yes, I can actually.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm gonna read it to make funnier this meeting. Well, René Ezequiel Saucedo says, congratulations for the presentations, to the approach to the projects and their social impact. Since I would like to know your opinion about what should be the role of the academy in the professionalization of projects with social impact and the generation of projects. Interesting. What should be the involvement in the evaluation of public policies implemented by the government? And these questions arise today. It seems that the academy and the professionalization of projects is detached from public policies, and only professionals are the ones who do projects. Okay, so maybe we can start with these three, and maybe in the meanwhile, I'm going to sort another questions we have here. Thank you, Frédéric.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, the question on academies and social impact is a very important question. It's exactly my point, actually. It's projects developed actually on a way to expertise, giving more and more importance to certain kinds of actors who are actually controlling most of what projects are. And in many cases, these projects have social and environmental implications. If you take industrial projects or architectural projects, many of them have such kinds of implications. And so it would be, of course, fantastic to recognize the political dimension these projects have and submit them to specific forms of public criticism, we could say. This was actually invented several times in history. I mentioned for French public works some kinds of devices that were developed in the 1820s and 30s, which were publicizing projects so that the population, the inhabitants, could react to project and protest. So people could go and say, we are not, we don't agree with that kind of thing because it will destroy this river, it will impact our economic situation, etc., etc. But in the end, if you look at these kinds of technology, of political technology, these consultations, these participation of ordinary people had no impact on the decision whatsoever. So it is very usual in these kinds of tools that were invented in policy in the 19th, and of course very much since the 1970s, which is participatory devices where people can go and participate in some way in projects, that in the end their impact is very, very low. So there are of course exceptions, but it's a main trend, so to speak. So it's very interesting the way that we could say there could be a control by the state on these kind of issues. Of course, you could imagine an academy that is stating what kind of social and environmental concerns projects should take into account. This is usually what legislation is doing, but you could also have some kind of external control inside a state administration. But usually this is very poor because it's usually the lowest standards states are putting on these kind of things, and it can be very decoupled from what people on the ground or in a real context want to hear and to see. So yes, it's a very important question. There is no one solution, obvious solution to that problem, because I would say societies have been testing different kinds of devices to take into account the opinion of ordinary people, of the inhabitants concerned by the project. And all these devices have been quite deceptive in the long run. So I have to say I'm quite pessimistic on the kind of things we could invent in the future. But yes, the question is still there, that there are some people who are usually professionals and who are concentrating most of the decision on that kind of subject, and that it should be otherwise, because obviously it's a political issue, and that in many contexts people do have an interest in that kind of things and do want to participate in that. Your question, Alejandro, on this, what should be historicized, and the shift from big works to small, common, ordinary project, is also something that I'm very interested in. I think that the concentration on the masterpieces is also a concentration on heroes, on big men. It's always some kind of thing that concentrates on the idea that projects are the work of genius, of inventors, important person who changed the world because they were free and they had a sort of genius and they could do it, so that others disappear. And I do absolutely agree. It's a shift, of course, important in the history of technology, but also in the history of science, that we're more interested in the smaller projects and in the smaller projectors, because actually they are what makes the world. So you have a few masterpieces in the world, but most of our cities and most of our landscapes are made by ordinary industrial plants, ordinary roads, ordinary houses, and very ordinary things. So, of course, if we want to change this world, or if we want to have some kind of grip on the future of that world, we should be concentrating on the ordinary side of projects. But then, if you say that, what comes immediately is that the ordinary things are usually the ones who get the less attention and the less money, especially. So if you can get my point about the fact that projects are about seducing someone and to sell him something to a certain point. And if people don't have the money, so you can seduce them to buy things that are cheaper because they won't have the money to buy something else. So it's not only some kind of it's a hierarchical problem. Of course, you will have fantastic things that are very expensive and chic, and you will have actually discount projects of many kinds because it's also a problem of what kind of things you can pay for. So inside, it's of course power relations that are also in this kind of these kind of difference. So I absolutely agree that comparing these two things and stressing the importance of smaller works and smaller projects is actually more important, because it is what makes our world. And yeah, if we want to have a grip on that, we should know these kinds of projects better, and how we could change them and get involved in them. Now, for the first question on, yes, some kind of projects require immediate actions and others more kind of permanent action. This is very tricky, because usually projects are in many ways a problem of rhetoric. It's people saying, we should do something because it's better, it's fantastic, it's new, it's right. They are selling something. So the question is, are they selling it because it's urgent and we should do something because it's otherwise it will be worse and worse? Or are they about imposing a new kind of power relation? So it was actually what I was stressing at the end of my talk. It's urgency is a very tricky thing. In the history of environment, it's actually a basic feature that each crisis is the occasions for several powerful actors to gain more power. So they come and they say, yes, we will have to change the rules because people, usually small people, are not able to develop the right tools and hand correctly this or that kind of environment. It has been done for rivers and forests in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And in the 19th century, for mountains, for the preservation of mountains, which was actually not about the preservation per se, but about the control of land and the kind of projects people could do there. So it's very complicated. Yes, in many cases there are real urgency and we have to act, and it's a political problem. I mean, politicians have to take decisions at some points, and these kinds of decisions are always uncertain. But we should be aware, relying on projects, that it can be an occasion for changing rules, and that, well, we should always take it as something that is preliminary and that can be changed later on. So we should have, and we should promote, I would say, forms of projects that are more evolutive, more which can learn more of the future, so that we can come back to other forms if it appears to be too disproportionate, to some people becomes too influential or things like that.
Okay, Frédéric, thanks a lot. We have here another very concrete questions, very concise. We are quite late. We have only 2 minutes in front, so I suggest we can take 5 minutes more. So we have 7 minutes. Well, you can see the chat, but I would like to stress one interesting question. There are others, but I'm going to read the last one. It says, projects are actions that have to be authorized. So, in terms of authorization, when can a project stop being a project? This is one quite theoretical issue, very interesting. And there's another one. One professor asks about your opinion on the issue interdisciplinarity in architectural projects, if you have an opinion about this in a general sense. So we have in front 6 minutes. Frédéric.
So it's a very good
take
question.
about 5
First
minutes
question,
more.
the theoretical one, on when does a project stops to be a project if it's about authorization. It's in a way it never stops, because authorization is at 2 moments, you could say. They are really decision-making moments. This is when you go to a desk. You have sometimes to go to real desks, like an administration to get an authorization, or you go to the bank. This is a real desk. You go to someone, you ask, you get an answer. It's yes or it's no, or it's you have to change this or that. So you have moments where you have really desk situations. And then you have many situations who are not really decision-making moments, which are more institutionalized moments, which is about the kind of knowledge you are taking with you, the kind of tools and rhetorical knowledge you have, the kind of people you know that will be interesting to put your project forwards in the right circles of decision-making, etc. So you have other things that are not really a moment of decision, but are really a habitus. It's you have been trained as an engineer or as an architect, so you know what you should do. And it's not even, many of these things are not even explicit. You cannot even say that it won't work because this or that is not exactly right. Many of these things are not, you cannot explicit them. They are, most of them, implicit. They are in a common culture, and you trained to be an engineer or an architect exactly in that way, to know what you should know in order to be doing your job. So in many of these professions, they concentrate in enormous power in a project system because they knew all the implicit things. And outsiders could not do it, not because they are less talented or less inventive, or etc., but because they don't know the basic rules of the game, so to speak. So a project is mainly moments of decisions and habitus that makes a kind of door, if you would like. So if you don't have the right knowledge, if you don't have the right contacts with the good, right people, if you don't have the right rhetoric, then the door will be closed. And it's something that is distributed in the time frame over the project. It's not exactly at some point of decision. It's all along that you have to have these basic tools. For interdisciplinary projects, I don't know much about architectural projects today, so I couldn't answer exactly to that question, but I could say a few things about interdisciplinary in projects more generally, in engineering projects, for instance, where you have now also social scientists who are contacted to be part of the job. It's usually very difficult because precisely there are these differences in culture, in habitus, about what counts as a project and what is important in a project. So it doesn't mean that in a discussion you cannot put forward some points that will be understood by the other parties, like engineers, for instance, if you are a social scientist. But it still is quite complicated, I would say, because most of what a project is solidified in expectations and in terms that cannot be easily changed. If you change these terms, you are changing the order of the rules of the game. You are changing the importance of the various people involved in that, and it's usually problematic. So yeah, it should be like the implications of citizens. It should be done, but it's I'm quite pessimistic about the way it could be made. Yeah.
Thanks, Frédéric. I would like to ask one more thing. It's very concrete, and let's be short. I'm going to try to be very concise. Daniel Abramson, an historian of architecture, says that before the sustainable period, we had, especially in North America, a period of planet obsolescence. An example, all the way the Chicago was frequently built and rebuilt and block down the buildings and again building. Suddenly arises in a part of the 20th century all this idea of sustainability as a big paradigm. So the obsolescence was live away, and now we are living on environmental paradigm, sustainability. What do you think is going to be happening in the next decades? You're not a futurologist, no.
No.
You also not anticipate things, but do you think environmental issues will be the big arena to discussing the projects, because it's the area where all the environmental experts help very much about things?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question, since yes, it's about the definition of what sustainability is about. You probably know that sustainability was defined in forestry in the 18th and early 19th century in Germany, and it's actually a maximizing concept. So sustainability is about producing more wood. It's about exploitation. It's about taking more from nature. Okay, so it's a very paradoxical concept from the beginning. And yes, I think we all have become green and environmental since the 90s or the 2000s, and it will become worse with the years to come. So I don't have exactly an answer for your question, but I think it's a very good point what you said. You can have a planned obsolescence in an organic world. It's of course not the same as in a world of oil. And planning the concrete destruction of materials that are not potentially returning to nature, like plastics and things like that, is of course not the same as planning the destruction of earth or of wood or any other kind of materials that are biological in some ways, or at least natural. So I hope it's a kind of answer.
Okay, thank you very much. We are on schedule now, so it seems to me that we're gonna close this session. I want to appreciate a lot the contributions of Frédéric. We're gonna maybe work in the next months with we are planning a book project, so that includes all these topics. So Frédéric, I really appreciate that you have been with us, and good luck there in Berlin, and hope to see you or hear from you soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye, Frédéric. Muchas gracias a todos, a todas y a todos los asistentes a esta conferencia. Nos vemos a las 11:20 de la mañana en el módulo de la conferencia de la mesa 1, que dará inicio en punto. Pedimos también a todos los ponentes que por favor se conecten antes, unos 15 minutos antes, para realizar pruebas de conexión y revisar los privilegios de sus cámaras y micrófonos y todas estas cosas. Bueno, por lo pronto, hasta aquí llegamos con este evento. Nos vemos en un ratito más a las 11:20. Gracias. Bonita mañana.